I told her if she went on that art retreat with him, I was gone. She laughed and called me paranoid. What she didn't know was that her casual mention of his name had already triggered something in my mind. She thought she was playing games, but I was about to show her what real strategy looks like. My name is Preston Holbrook. I'm 58 years old, and I've spent the last 25 years as Director of Procurement for Meridian Industries. When you control a $100 million annual budget, you learn to spot patterns, read between the lines, and trust your gut when something doesn't add up. Unfortunately, I applied those skills better to vendor negotiations than to my own marriage. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday night in October. Whitney was loading the dishwasher, humming some tune I didn't recognize, when she casually mentioned her weekend plans. "Daniel's organizing this amazing retreat in Napa Valley," she said, not looking up from the plates. "Wine tasting, spa treatments, the whole 9 yards. I already booked my spot." Daniel. That name had been popping up in her conversations more frequently over the past few months. Daniel from her art class. Daniel who understood her creative side. Daniel who apparently had enough disposable income to organize weekend getaways for his students. "Since when do you go on retreats with your art instructor?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Whitney finally looked at me, and I caught something in her expression, defiance mixed with guilt. It was the same look our daughter Evelyn used to give me when she was 16 and testing boundaries. "Preston, you're being paranoid," Whitney said, laughing. "It's just a group of artists exploring wine country. Nothing scandalous about that." But the way she said "scandalous" told me she'd already thought about what might be scandalous. When you've negotiated with suppliers trying to hide cost overruns, you develop an ear for the words people choose when they're not telling the whole truth. I set down my coffee mug and looked directly at her. "Whitney, if you're planning to run around with this guy, I need you to know something. I'm gone. No discussions, no counseling, no second chances. I'm done." The silence that followed felt like the moment before a major contract falls through. That split second when you realize all your careful planning might have been for nothing. Whitney's laugh came out sharp and forced. "Oh, for crying out loud, Preston. You sound like some jealous teenager. Daniel is a professional. I'm a married woman. And frankly, your possessiveness is getting old." She turned back to the dishes, dismissing me like I was some vendor who'd overstayed his welcome. But I'd deliver my message, and in my business, you only say things once. After that, actions speak louder than words. That night, lying in bed while Whitney scrolled through her phone beside me, I made a decision that would have made my military father proud. I wasn't going to beg, plead, or try to compete with some art instructor who probably lived off trust fund money and romantic gestures. I was going to prepare for war. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done since my early days at Meridian. I made a backup plan. The next morning, I did what any seasoned procurement director would do when facing a potential vendor betrayal. I started gathering intelligence. Whitney had already left for her morning yoga class, or at least that's what she called it these days. I had my doubts about how much actual yoga was happening. I opened my laptop and logged into our shared cloud storage account. Whitney wasn't particularly tech-savvy, which meant she never bothered to check what got automatically backed up from her phone. Photos, messages, location data. It was all there, cataloged like evidence in a federal investigation. The photos folder told a story Whitney probably didn't realize she was writing. There they were, pictures from the past 6 months that painted a timeline I'd been too busy to notice. Whitney and Daniel of various coffee shops, art galleries, and restaurants, always sitting just a little too close, her hand touching his arm, both of them looking at each other instead of the camera. But it was the metadata that really got my attention. The timestamps showed these weren't random encounters. They were meeting twice a week, sometimes 3 times, always when she told me she was doing something else. The locations were consistent too. The same wine bar downtown, the same park where she claimed to go jogging alone. Then I found a folder labeled Art Projects. Inside were photos that had nothing to do with art and everything to do with what Whitney was really working on. Pictures of Daniel's apartment, his car, even shots of them together that she'd clearly taken for her own private collection. One photo showed them on his couch, her head on his shoulder, both looking relaxed and intimate in a way that made my stomach turn. I heard Whitney's key in the lock and quickly closed the laptop. She walked in carrying her yoga mat, face flushed, looking more energetic than she had in months. How was class? I asked. Oh, you know how it is, Whitney said, avoiding eye contact. Challenging poses today. I'm getting better at the difficult positions. I bet she was. I've been thinking about your Napa trip, I said casually. Maybe I should meet this Daniel character. You know, shake hands with the man who's teaching my wife so much about art. Whitney's face went pale for just a second before she forced a smile. Preston, that's sweet, but Daniel values the artistic process. He doesn't really do the husband meeting thing. It might throw off the group dynamic. Group dynamic. Right. Well, maybe you could show me some of your recent artwork then, I suggested. I'd love to see what you've been creating with all this inspiration. The silence stretched between us like a cable about to snap. Whitney set down her yoga mat and headed toward the kitchen. I'm still working on my current piece, she called over her shoulder. It's not ready to be seen yet. That evening, I made a call to Jerome Price, a private investigator I'd worked with during some corporate security issues at Meridian. Jerome was thorough, discreet, and expensive, exactly what I needed. Preston Holbrook, I said when he answered. I need your services again. Personal matter this time. What kind of personal matter? Jerome asked. The kind that requires documentation and might end up in court. Jerome's chuckle was dry. Understood. When do you want to start? Yesterday would have been good. Tomorrow will have to do. By the time Whitney returned from another art class, the following evening, Jerome had already positioned himself with a clear view of Daniel's apartment building. Within 48 hours, I'd have photographs, timestamps, and enough evidence to bury Whitney's lie deeper than a failed defense contract. Jerome's first report arrived on Thursday morning, delivered to my office at Meridian like any other business document. The photos were professionally shot and devastatingly clear. Whitney and Daniel entering his apartment building together. Whitney leaving 3 hours later, hair disheveled, clothes wrinkled. Daniel kissing her goodbye in a parking garage where they thought no one could see them. But Jerome had included something unexpected in his report, a background check on Daniel Kane that made my blood boil. The man wasn't just an art instructor. He was a con artist with a history of targeting wealthy married women. 3 previous relationships with wives of successful businessmen, all ending when the husbands discovered what was happening. Daniel had a pattern, and Whitney was just his latest mark. That evening, I made a decision that would have shocked my procurement team. I called my brother. Most people don't know I have a twin brother. Derek Holbrook lives in Seattle, works as a corporate restructuring specialist, and we've maintained careful distance since our father's death 5 years ago. But Derek and I share more than DNA. We share the exact same face, the same voice, the same build. The only difference is Derek's scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood accident. Preston, Derek said when he answered. This is unexpected. I need a favor, I said. The kind that requires your particular skills and our unique family resemblance. Derek specialized in corporate takeovers, which meant he knew how to infiltrate organizations, gather intelligence, and execute complex strategic plans. He also owed me a significant favor from when I'd helped finance his divorce settlement 3 years earlier. What kind of favor? Derek asked. My wife is cheating with a professional con man. I need someone to get close to him, find out his next move, and gather evidence that will destroy both of them in court. The line went quiet for a moment. You want me to pretend to be you? No, I said. I want you to be yourself. But I want Daniel to think he's dealing with a different Holbrook brother. Someone with even more money and connections than I have. Derek's laugh was cold. Corporate espionage tactics applied to domestic warfare. I like it. Within 48 hours, Derek was in town, posing as a wealthy investor interested in Daniel's art program. His plan was brilliant in its simplicity. Infiltrate Daniel's social circle, document his methods, and potentially record him bragging about his conquest of my wife. Meanwhile, I continued my regular routine, giving Whitney no indication that I knew about her affair. When she mentioned her upcoming Napa retreat, I even offered to pay for spa treatments. That's so generous, Preston, Whitney said, practically glowing. Daniel will be so impressed by your thoughtfulness. I'm sure he will be, I replied, knowing that by the time Daniel met my brother, his opinion of the Holbrook family would change dramatically. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait for them to walk into it. While Derek worked his magic infiltrating Daniel's circle, I focused on what I did best, managing assets and controlling financial flow. 25 years of handling multi-million-dollar procurement budgets had taught me exactly how to move money without raising flags. The first step was activating the trust fund I'd established when Evelyn turned 18. Most couples put their assets in joint accounts, but I'd learned from watching too many colleagues get destroyed in divorces. Our house, investments, and business interests were structured through a complex web of trusts and LLCs that Whitney had signed without reading the fine print. Evelyn drove down from Sacramento that weekend, ostensibly for her birthday celebration, but really for an emergency financial briefing. At 26, she worked as a project manager for a tech startup and had inherited my analytical mind along with Whitney's artistic eye. "Dad, what's going on?" Evelyn asked as we sat in my home office. "Your message sounded serious." I handed her the folder containing Jerome's photos and Derek's preliminary intelligence report. Evelyn studied them with the same methodical approach she used for software development projects. "Mom's having an affair," she said finally. It wasn't a question. "With a man who's done this before," I replied. "Multiple times. Your mother isn't his first target, and she won't be his last unless we stop him." Evelyn closed the folder and looked directly at me. "What do you need me to do?" "Legally, you're now the primary beneficiary of the family trust. The house transfers to you, along with 60% of our investment portfolio. Your mother will be left with what she brought into the marriage, plus whatever the court decides is fair. And if she fights it," I smiled, "that's where Uncle Derek comes in. By the time he's finished gathering evidence, your mother won't have a legal leg to stand on." Evelyn nodded slowly. "Does she know any of this is happening?" "She's too busy planning her romantic getaway to notice her world is being restructured around her." That evening, Whitney came home late again, claiming she'd been at a gallery opening with Daniel's art group. She seemed distracted, almost giddy, and I realized she was probably planning to tell me about Napa soon. The lies were getting harder for her to maintain, which meant she was getting ready to force a confrontation. Perfect. I prefer to fight battles on ground of my own choosing, with weapons my opponent didn't know I possessed. Jerome called that night with an update. "Your brother's impressive," he said. "He's got Daniel believing he's interested in investing in some kind of art retreat center. Daniel's already bragging about his successful track record with lonely wives and asking for advice on how to extract maximum financial benefit from his current situation. Is he recording these conversations?" "Everything. Video, audio, documentation. Your wife's boyfriend is about to confess his entire operation to someone he thinks is a potential business partner." I hung up the phone and poured myself a scotch. In 48 hours, Whitney would leave for Napa thinking she was starting a new chapter of her life. Instead, she'd be walking directly into the closing chapter of the biggest mistake she'd ever made. Derek's intelligence operation exceeded my expectations. Within 3 days, he positioned himself as Daniel's potential business partner and recorded enough evidence to destroy both Daniel and Whitney in any courtroom. But Derek had also suggested something that appealed to my sense of poetic justice. Daniel's been bragging about his success rate with wealthy wives. Derek told me over dinner at an upscale restaurant downtown. He thinks he's untouchable because these women are too embarrassed to expose him publicly. But he's never dealt with someone who fights back strategically. "What are you proposing?" Derek smiled. "A final performance. Something that will shatter Whitney's fantasy and expose Daniel's true nature simultaneously." The plan was elegant. Derek would arrange a meeting with Daniel at the same restaurant where Whitney and Daniel had their romantic dinners. Derek would present himself as a successful investor interested in Daniel's relationship consulting business, essentially his con operation. The meeting would be recorded, and Derek would get Daniel to admit his entire scheme on camera. Meanwhile, I would execute the Bentley operation. The Bentley had been sitting in my garage for 2 years, a luxury purchase I had made during a particularly profitable quarter at Meridian. Whitney had loved it initially, posting photos of herself with the car on social media. But when I'd suggested she learn to drive it properly, she'd lost interest. "Too complicated," she'd said. "Too much responsibility." Perfect symbolism for our marriage. Jerome would position the Bentley in Whitney's reserved parking space at our condo complex, not blocking it, but occupying it completely. When Whitney returned from her art class, really another afternoon with Daniel, she'd find her space taken by a car that represented everything she'd thrown away. But the real genius was Jerome himself. At 31, he looked successful, confident, and mysterious. He'd stand beside the Bentley like he owned both the car and the space, creating the impression that I'd moved on to bigger and better things while she was slumming with a con artist. "This is psychological warfare," Evelyn said when I explained the plan. "You're making her realize what she's losing." "I'm making her face reality," I corrected. "Daniel is using her. I built something real, and she's throwing it away for fantasy." The timing had to be perfect. Derek's meeting with Daniel was scheduled for Thursday afternoon. Whitney's return from her latest art session was predictably around 5 o'clock. Jerome would be in position by 4:30, giving Whitney just enough time to see the Bentley and wonder who was driving her husband's car before the real revelation began. Wednesday night, Whitney was unusually affectionate, probably feeling guilty about her upcoming weekend in Napa. She cooked my favorite dinner and even suggested watching a movie together. "Preston," she said during dinner, "I know things have been tense between us lately. Maybe when I get back from the retreat, we could take a vacation together. Just the two of us." I looked at my wife of 28 years and felt nothing but sadness. She was still trying to have it both ways. Keep her stable marriage while pursuing her exciting affair. She had no idea that by Sunday evening, she'd have neither. "That sounds nice, Whitney," I said. "We should definitely talk about our future when you get back." Thursday afternoon arrived with the precision of a military operation. Derek texted me at 3:15 p.m. Target acquired. Recording in progress. Jerome confirmed his position at 4:20 p.m. Bentley positioned. Standing by. I was in my office at Meridian, reviewing quarterly procurement reports and maintaining perfect normalcy while my carefully orchestrated plan executed itself across town. To my colleagues, it was just another Thursday. They had no idea their procurement director was simultaneously dismantling his wife's affair and rebuilding his family's future. At 4:45 p.m., Jerome sent a photo. Whitney's Honda was approaching the parking garage, and he was standing beside the Bentley looking like he belonged there. The psychological impact would be immediate and devastating. At 5:02 p.m., Derek called. "It's done," he said simply. Daniel confessed everything on camera. "The man's a complete sociopath, Preston." He described Whitney as financially promising, but emotionally needy. He's planning to string her along until he can access her accounts, then disappear to Costa Rica with whatever he can steal. Did he mention the other women? 3 of them. Whitney's not even his primary target. There's a doctor's wife in Phoenix who's apparently funding most of his lifestyle. I felt a strange mix of vindication and disgust. Whitney had destroyed our marriage for a man who saw her as nothing more than a secondary income source. Jerome called at 5:18 p.m. She saw the car. Stood there for about 5 minutes, just staring. I could see her trying to figure out who I was and why I had access to your Bentley. "She's inside the building now, probably calling you." My phone buzzed 30 seconds later. Whitney's number. "Preston." Her voice was tight with confusion and anger. "There's someone in my parking space with your car." "Who is he?" "I have no idea what you're talking about," I said calmly. "My car is in the garage at work, where it always is." "Preston, I'm looking at the Bentley right now. There's a man standing next to it like he owns it. Maybe you should ask him who he is." "I'm asking you." "Whitney, I'm in a meeting. We'll talk when I get home." I hung up and smiled. Phase 1 was complete. Whitney was off balance, confused, and beginning to realize that things weren't as simple as she'd assumed. Tonight, when she tried to call Daniel for comfort, she discovered he wasn't answering his phone. Derek would make sure of that. By tomorrow morning, Whitney would understand that her fantasy weekend in Napa had become the opening move in a chess game she was destined to lose. Friday morning, Whitney packed for Napa with the enthusiasm of someone heading to her own execution. She didn't know Derek had already exposed Daniel's operation, or that Jerome had documented enough evidence to destroy her credibility in any divorce proceeding. She thought she was escaping to romance. Instead, she was walking into a trap. "Preston, I'll call you when I get there," Whitney said, avoiding eye contact as she loaded her suitcase in her Honda. "Take your time," I replied. "Enjoy your retreat." She drove away at 9:15 a.m., still believing she was in control of her destiny. By 10 a.m., Jerome was positioned outside Daniel's apartment building. By noon, Derek had Daniel sitting in a restaurant confessing his entire operation to hidden cameras. "The Holbrook woman is perfect," Daniel told Derek, thinking he was speaking to a potential business partner. "Married to money, emotionally vulnerable, and stupid enough to think this is about love. I'll have access to her accounts within a month." Derek's recording captured everything. Daniel's confession about multiple affairs, his plans to drain Whitney's finances, even his backup strategy if I discovered the affair. The man had contingencies for everything except someone like Derek infiltrating his operation. At 4 p.m., Whitney called from Napa. "Preston, something's wrong." Her voice was shaky. "Daniel's not here. The retreat is supposed to start tonight, but the hotel says there's no group reservation. No one knows anything about an art retreat." "That's strange," I said calmly. "Maybe there was a miscommunication. I've been calling Daniel all day. His phone goes straight to voicemail." "Preston, what if something happened to him?" "I'm sure he's fine, Whitney. Maybe check with the art studio where you take classes." But Whitney had already called the studio. There was no Daniel Kane on their instructor roster. Never had been. The man she'd been having an affair with for 6 months had been using a fake identity and a fabricated connection to the art world. Saturday morning, Whitney drove home in silence. No phone calls, no texts, just 8 hours of interstate highway giving her time to realize how completely she'd been played. Daniel had vanished like smoke, taking her dignity and her marriage with him. Jerome was waiting when she arrived. Not in the Bentley this time, but standing beside a moving truck parked outside our condo building. Men in uniforms were loading boxes and furniture, all marked with tags indicating my name and new destination. Whitney parked and stared at the scene like someone witnessing an accident. Everything that belonged to me was being systematically removed from our shared life. The antique desk from my father, the wine collection I've been building for 20 years, even the tools from the garage. "Excuse me." Whitney called to Jerome. "What's going on here?" Jerome looked at her with professional courtesy. "Asset relocation, ma'am. Mr. Holbrook is establishing a new residence." "A new residence? Where?" "I'm not authorized to discuss Mr. Holbrook's personal arrangements." Whitney pulled out her phone and called me. I was in my office at Meridian, finalizing the last details of my separation strategy. "Preston, there are movers at our condo. They're taking your things." "What's happening?" "I'm relocating some assets to a more secure location," I said. "After your weekend revelation, I decided it was time to make some changes." "What weekend revelation?" "Preston, Daniel disappeared. The whole retreat was a lie." "I know." The silence stretched between us like a canyon. Whitney was finally beginning to understand that while she'd been playing games, I'd been playing chess. "We need to talk," she whispered. "Yes," I agreed. "We do." Sunday evening, Whitney sat across from me at our kitchen table like a defendant waiting for sentencing. The confident woman who'd mocked my warnings had been replaced by someone who looked fragile and lost. Between us lay Derek's recordings, Jerome's surveillance photos, and legal documents that would reshape our future. "Preston, I made a mistake," Whitney began. "Daniel was using me. I can see that now. But we can fix this. We can go to counseling, rebuild trust." I pressed play on Derek's recording. Daniel's voice filled the kitchen, describing Whitney as financially promising but emotionally needy, and detailing his plans to extract money from our accounts before disappearing to Costa Rica. Whitney's face crumpled as she heard herself described like a mark in a confidence game. "He said he loved me," she whispered. "Daniel Kane isn't even his real name," I said. "He's a professional con artist who targets wealthy men's wives. You were just his latest assignment. How long have you known?" "Long enough to protect our assets and gather evidence that will stand up in court." I slid a legal document across the table. "Divorce papers. You can sign them voluntarily, or we can go to court and make this public. Your choice." Whitney picked up the papers with trembling hands. "This gives me almost nothing. It gives you what you brought into the marriage plus what the court considers fair after documented adultery with a known criminal. That's more generous than you deserve. Our daughter, Evelyn, knows everything. She supports my decision. She's also the new primary beneficiary of the family trust, which means you can't touch the assets you never actually contributed to anyway." Whitney looked around the kitchen, probably noticing for the first time how empty it seemed without my personal belongings. "Where will I live?" "That's your problem to solve. You wanted adventure and spontaneity. Now you get to experience both." Evelyn walked into the kitchen, carrying her own set of documents. "Mom, I need you to sign these transfer papers. The house is going into my name, and you have 30 days to find new accommodations." "Evelyn, honey, please don't do this. Your father is manipulating you." Evelyn's voice was steady and cold. Dad showed me the evidence, Mom. Pictures, recordings, financial records. You threw away our family for a con artist who was planning to steal from us. This isn't manipulation. This is consequences. Whitney signed the papers because she had no choice. Her fantasy had crumbled, her lover had vanished, and the family she'd taken for granted was cutting her loose with surgical precision. As she packed her remaining belongings, I felt no satisfaction, no victory. Just the quiet relief of a man who'd successfully defended what mattered most against someone who'd tried to destroy it. Whitney moved out on Tuesday morning, driving away in the same Honda she'd taken to Napa, but this time heading toward a future she'd never planned for and couldn't control. The woman who'd thought she was too smart to be fooled had discovered that some games have professional players. 6 months after Whitney moved out, I stood in the living room of my new house with Evelyn and Derek, watching Jerome install the final security system. The property was everything Whitney had never appreciated: understated elegance, strategic location, and bulletproof privacy. No social media staging opportunities, just solid construction and intelligent design. "Dad, the trust paperwork is finalized," Evelyn said, handing me a folder. "Everything's properly protected now. Mom can't touch any of it, even if she tries to challenge the divorce decree." Derek looked up from his laptop, where he was reviewing security footage from Daniel's arrest. "Speaking of Whitney's boyfriend, he's facing federal charges in 3 states. The FBI used our recordings as primary evidence. He won't be scamming anyone for the next 15 years. Justice had been swift and thorough. Daniel's criminal network had collapsed within weeks of Derek's investigation. Multiple wives had come forward with similar stories, and the federal prosecutors had built an airtight case using our evidence as the foundation. "What about Whitney?" I asked. "Living in a studio apartment downtown," Evelyn reported without emotion. "Working retail at a clothing store. She tried to contact me last month, wanting to rebuild our relationship, but I told her actions have consequences that don't disappear because you finally understand them. My daughter had inherited my strategic mind, but possessed a clarity about relationships that I'd lacked at her age. She understood that forgiveness wasn't the same as restoration, and that some betrayals create permanent changes in family dynamics." Jerome finished his installation and handed me the system controls. "Everything's operational, Mr. Holbrook. Motion sensors, cameras, secure communications. Nobody gets close to this property without you knowing about it." "Expecting trouble?" Derek asked. "Preventing it," I corrected. "I've learned the value of preparation." That evening, I sat on my back deck overlooking the lake, drinking scotch and reviewing procurement contracts for Meridian's next quarter. My life had found its rhythm again. Work that challenged me, family relationships built on mutual respect, and personal space that belonged entirely to me. Evelyn joined me for dinner every Sunday. Derek visited monthly, usually with updates on new business ventures we were exploring together. Even Jerome had become a friend rather than just a service provider, occasionally stopping by to discuss security innovations and share war stories from his investigative work. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Whitney, probably trying a new approach to contact me." I deleted it without reading the message. Some doors, once closed, should stay that way. The man who'd spent 28 years trying to make someone else happy had discovered the satisfaction of building a life based on competence, loyalty, and clear boundaries. Whitney had taught me an invaluable lesson. Sometimes the best thing someone can do for you is leave. 1 year later, I received an invitation that perfectly illustrated how completely my life had changed. Derek's company was acquiring Daniel's former art studio property, and he wanted me to attend the closing ceremony. The building where Whitney had pretended to take classes would become the headquarters for our new consulting firm. "Poetic justice," Derek said as we toured the empty studios. "The place where your marriage ended becomes the foundation for our business partnership." Evelyn had joined us for the occasion, bringing architectural plans for renovating the space. She'd recently completed her project management certification and would oversee the transformation from artistic pretense to corporate efficiency. "Dad, I found something interesting in the property records," Evelyn said, handing me a document. "Whitney tried to buy this building 6 months ago. Her loan application was rejected for insufficient income and poor credit history. The irony was perfect. Whitney had wanted to own the place, where she'd fallen for a con artist's lies, probably imagining some romantic scenario where she'd create an artistic sanctuary. Instead, the building would become a monument to strategic thinking and professional competence. Jerome arrived with the final security assessment. Clean property, Mr. Holbrook. Daniel's operation left no lasting security concerns. The building's ready for whatever you want to make it. That afternoon, I received a call from Meridian's CEO offering me the position of Chief Procurement Officer with a 20% salary increase. The company valued my strategic thinking and wanted to expand my authority across multiple divisions. Preston, he said, your work this past year has been exceptional. You've streamlined our vendor relationships, eliminated cost overruns, and improved efficiency across the board. We want to build the next 5 years around your leadership. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Whitney had been chasing fantasy adventures, I'd been building real success. Her betrayal had freed me from the energy drain of managing someone else's emotional chaos, allowing me to focus entirely on what I did best. Derek and I signed the partnership papers that evening, officially launching Holbrook Strategic Consulting. Our first client was already secured, a government contractor who needed procurement expertise for international defense projects. As I drove home to my lake house, I reflected on the journey from betrayal to reconstruction. Whitney had thought she was discarding a boring, predictable man for exciting possibilities. Instead, she'd freed a strategic thinker who'd been constrained by trying to make an ungrateful partner happy. The woman who'd mocked my warnings and posted photos in another man's arms was now working retail to pay rent on a studio apartment. The man she thought was too dull for adventure had built a consulting empire and was planning international business expansion. Sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming the person you were always capable of being once the right people get out of your way.